Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. This is your brother Daniel Haqiqatjou. I am here with another installment of Muslim Skeptic Live. And inshallah, today I'm going to do something different. I want to go step by step and carefully analyze one of the most popular videos from a murtad, from an apostate of Islam on YouTube. And in this video, a person who goes by the Masked Arab gives seven main reasons why he left Islam. And so we want to analyze all of the reasoning that he gives, provide refutations, and basically debunk this guy's argument. And I picked this video because it's extremely popular. It has almost 1 million views. And so I think that it's important as Muslims that those who are able to and are able to go through the details and refute things like this, to put out material to make sure that people know the truth about these issues and to recognize some of the blatant misinterpretations of Islam, some of the faulty reasoning, faulty logic within some of these. They call themselves ex-Muslims. I don't like that term because the term that I use is from Islam, murtad, someone who has gone through irtidad and rejected Islam after believing. So we call people by our terms. We don't adopt other people's terms, we don't prioritize their ideology in doing so. So inshallah, we're going to go through this video. I cut it to about 20 minutes. I took out a lot of the repetition in the video, but for the most part, it's mostly there. So we'll watch it. Inshallah, I'll give the response and some explanation, and then hopefully we might have time for questions. Maybe not, because it's a very long video, but I'll do my best to answer any questions, inshallah. So with that, Bismillah, Alhamdulillah, Salatu wassalam ala Rasulillah. Let's go to the Masked Arab.
Hello and welcome.
Hold on, sorry, the volume is not loud enough. Okay.
Hello and welcome. This is the Masked Arab. In this video, I'll be going through the 7 main reasons why I left Islam. I will try to keep it as short as I can, but we have a lot to get through, so let's get going. Now, before I start, let me just quickly preempt the usual criticism and accusations from the apologists.
I'm not going to believe what you say because you're just making it up.
I realize you don't trust me, and being skeptical is a good thing, so I'll have my sources in the description below and you can check them for yourself.
Okay. So he's trying to preempt some of the things that what he calls apologists will say in response to this video. So he says that, apologists might say, you don't know what you're talking about, or you're going to talk about things out of context. And so he tries to preempt that by saying, no, this is not a valid criticism against me. So my critique of his points are not going to be mostly about things being out of context, even though in some parts he's blatantly ignoring context and even distorting some facts. So if you distort context or you leave out context, that can make a big difference, right? If I say that, okay, a man was electrocuted to death by a team of people, you might think, oh, well, that's cruel, that's barbaric. How can a man be executed like that through electrocution? That's tortuous. But then you realize, no, this was a criminal, a serial killer who was on death row, and this is the death penalty. then okay, that context is important for judging what has actually happened. So same thing with this masked Arab. He ignores a lot of context for certain cases, and so it's necessary to bring that up. Otherwise, he's giving a false impression. So.
Okay.
Okay, back to the video. So here he gives his first reason, his first evidence that Islam is false.
So reason one, the Quran is not perfect and contains basic scientific errors. We all know, if we have any understanding of our reality, that the universe most likely began as a Big Bang. Now, some Muslim preachers will embarrassingly claim that this is foretold in the Quran 1400 years ago. In this verse, it basically says that the earth and heavens were one and then split apart. Well, sorry, but that is nowhere near describing the Big Bang. For starters, Earth formed as a result of the universe coming into existence and could not have existed at the very beginning of the universe. Earth was only formed around 9 billion years after the Big Bang, so it was never there at the moment of the Big Bang. And if it was, the planet would have been incinerated in the face of such heat and force.
Alright, so the first point here, like he says that clearly this doesn't refer to the Big Bang. He cites the ayah from the Quran, have those who disbelieve not considered that the heavens and the earth were a joint entity, and we separated them and made from water every living thing. Okay, so why does that clearly not refer to the Big Bang? I'm not saying it does refer to the Big Bang, but how can he say so definitively that it clearly does not refer to the Big Bang? And so that doesn't really have much weight when he says something like that and just, stipulates that, okay, that can't refer to the Big Bang. So again, we see that he's very slippery with making just assertions and taking that as evidence and proof. Okay.
Moving back to the point of scientific inaccuracy, the Quran repeatedly tells us in the clearest of terms that the earth was created first before the heavens. Quran verse 229, He it is who created for you all that is in the earth, then turned he to the heaven, and fashioned it as 7 heavens, and he is knower of all things. Chapter 41 verses 9 to 12 also give us the same order, that the earth came before the heavens. The order here is absolutely wrong and irrational, but in line with what a desert Bedouin in the 7th century might have thought.
Right, again, so how does he know what the Quran is referring to in these ayat, in these verses? So he's just making all of these assertions about what it has to mean. For example, when we go back to one of these ayat, so when Allah is creating the earth and what is in it, how does he know that this is referring to the order? Because it's possible that the samawat were created, but then they were later fashioned, or they were very later developed by Allah. So he is, being very selective with how he's interpreting the ayat in a very specific way. And many of the people who argue against the Quran, saying it violates science, are making a basic logical error in this way. They presume to know exactly what the Quran is referring to. And so the way to address these kinds of critiques of Islam and the supposed scientific inaccuracy of the Quran is with 2 basic questions. Okay, there are 2 basic questions here, or 2 basic assumptions, and this is what we can always ask. So first of all, this first assumption, what contemporary science describes about the world is 100% accurate, which is why we can use that science as a benchmark to refute revelation. Okay? So this is one assumption. But is this an accurate assumption? No, right? Not even scientists consider contemporary scientific consensus as being the final word about how the universe is and how the world works, right? So if scientists themselves don't think that science has the final word, then how can it be used as this, benchmark to criticize Revelation, to criticize the Quran? And the fact of the matter is that even what is considered to be the consensus today about the Big Bang and general relativity and quantum mechanics, so these theories are in great flux, right? Because you even have theorists today, and my training, I studied physics at Harvard as an undergrad. You have scientists today who are proposing theories that are far beyond anything that anyone could have thought just 20 years ago or 30 years ago, such as the multiverse, right? This is the newest idea, the newest theory that is being proposed by theoretical physicists, is that there's a multiverse, and that actually the visible universe is one out of an infinite number of other universes. So the whole conception of what the universe is would fundamentally change if that turned out to be the case. That's a question whether that can be empirically proven or not, but that's a separate discussion, right? So you have, or the idea of 21-dimensional universe. This is one of the postulates of string theory within theoretical physics, is that the universe has more than 3 spatial dimensions and 1 time dimension. In fact, the universe might have 21 dimensions. And so these are the kinds of theories about fundamental reality. It's constantly in flux. And when we look at the history of science, we see evidence of this. So we see, all of these kinds of major changes and paradigm shifts and so on and so forth. So this first assumption that a lot of what these apostates and atheists are arguing against the scientific accuracy of the Quran is not even a valid assumption. It's not even borne out by science today. And then the second assumption, the language that contemporary science uses to describe the world, is the only accurate way to describe the world. Why should we believe that? Right? Why should we believe that the language that science uses, contemporary science, is the only valid way to describe the world? Because it's possible that you have other cultures, other religions, other thought systems, other philosophies that are referring to reality, but just using different language, using different terminology. Okay? So what the masked Arab is doing here is he's saying, when the Quran is talking about the heavens and the earth, and the Quran is talking about how these things were formed, this is just inaccurate according to science. Well, first of all, how do you know that the science is accurate and that science has the final word on how reality is? That's assumption number 1. And then assumption number 2, even if we take it for granted that science as it is now has accurately understood the nature of the universe, then you can still have different ways of describing that reality. And that this is even the case with contemporary English language, right? For example, if I say, hey, John, hand me over that notebook. Okay, hand me over that notebook. Okay, well, science knows, supposedly, that, this is not what a notebook is really just a composition of different molecules. And those different molecules are a composition of different atoms. So when you say, hand me over that notebook, that's inaccurate. You're talking about a notebook? No, the reality is that these are atoms, and we can weigh those atoms. And actually now we know that atoms have a nucleus with protons and neutrons, and then also electrons. And we also know that actually protons and neutrons are made of quarks and gluons and all of these different subatomic particles. So it's even inaccurate to say that, oh, this notebook is formed with atoms. No. Okay, it's the reality is gluons and quarks and leptons and so on and so forth. So the language, right? So it depends how is it correct to say that I have a notebook in my hand? Is that an accurate statement? So when the Quran is talking about when Allah is speaking about the heavens and the earth and all of these different cosmological things, or the kawakib, the planets or the satellites, nujum, stars, and so forth, is it how can you say that that's inherently inaccurate? It's only inaccurate if you make the mistake of thinking that only the language of contemporary astronomy in its very defined way, with its specific definitions, that's the only way that we can talk about the world. So this is a mistaken assumption. And if you understand this point, then all of these kinds of criticisms of the Quran on the basis of its quote-unquote scientific inaccuracy, all of those you can address very easily if you understand these 2 points. Okay, when it comes to science, how do we even know what we don't know, right? How arrogant is it to think that what science has determined and what is the contemporary scientific consensus is the final word, and we truly understand reality for what it is, right? Muslims don't accept that. Our epistemology is that God, the creator of everything, reveals how the universe is formed and different aspects of how the universe works. Of course, the Quran is not a scientific textbook, but that doesn't mean it doesn't contain information about what's around us, where we come from, it's the nature of reality. Okay, so why should we discard that and put our faith in the current scientific consensus, which is changing so drastically and has a history of such change and indeterminacy, and use that as a basis to refute revelation? I mean, that doesn't make sense for Muslims, and for non-Muslims, it is the job of the masked Arab to show, to prove that these 2 assumptions are valid. Okay, and as I explained, there's a lot of reasons to think that they're not valid. Okay, so let's continue.
Also, looking at the verses in chapter 41, the verses 9 to 12, we find that it takes God at least twice as long to build Earth than it does for him to build everything else in our vast universe. The fact that it would take God longer to build our tiny planet is telling us the author of the Quran had a very geocentric view and was oblivious to reality and the scale of our planet.
All right, so this is, a very simple point. Allah can create simply by saying be, and it is. Kun fayakun. Allah simply says be, and then whatever he wants to create, whatever he wills to create, comes into existence. So the fact that Allah is giving us different information about the length of time that he has chosen to create different things, that doesn't have any bearing on the size or the complexity or the nature of what it is that he is creating. Right? The fact that Allah is spending more time or indicating more time for certain aspects of his creation might mean that he just wants us to realize that this is an important creation, that this is something that we have to pay attention to as believers. And that's something that we have to take note of as being significant in the universe. And God is honoring that thing. So this is a very weak objection that he's making. And it shows that he doesn't really understand some basic theological points about Islam and how, what God says about himself, how God creates. So these kinds of mistakes that he's making indicate that he didn't really, if he actually was a Muslim and then left Islam, it doesn't seem like he had a very deep understanding of Islam, because this is something that kun fayakun, be and it is. This is something even my little kids know, right, about God. This is something that all Muslims learn, and any Muslim who reads through the Quran is aware of kun fayakun, be and it is. So this indicates his ignorance. Oh, and the other point that I want to make, he says that the Quran is clearly geocentric. And again, this is just cherry picking, because in other verses, Allah is saying, for example, أَأَنْتُمْ أَشَدُّ خَلْقًا أَمِ السَّمَاءِ, right, in Surah Nazi'at. He's saying, أَأَنْتُمْ أَشَدُّ خَلْقًا أَمِ السَّمَاءِ. Are you the greater creation, or the heavens, or the sky? Right, and so it's a rhetorical question, and the indication is that the heavens, the sky, that is the more significant or weighty creation. And so this is in the Quran, and there are other ayat that indicate this same kind of idea, that human beings are actually very small in the grand scheme of the entirety of the creation of the universe. And there's even hadith where the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, peace be upon him, says that the earth is compared to the heavens, or compared to the lowest heaven, is like a ring thrown into the desert, right? And again, so showing the insignificance and the relative size and magnitude of the earth, of the lower heavens, compared to the seven heavens, as compared to the throne of Allah, the Arsh. So these are all indications of the kind of ontology of creation, of what Allah has created, what exists, and how do they compare with each other. So it's not geocentric in that sense at all.
Moving on, a recurring topic in the Quran is that of the purpose of stars. We are told that they are in the lowest heaven, so the layer of heaven closest to the earth, and that their purpose is twofold. One is stars were created to be a decoration for the night sky, and the other is that they act as a form of protection for God and the angels, and what's called the High Council or Exalted Assembly in heaven, where God and the angels reside.
So it's very basic mistakes that no Muslim would actually make. Like nowhere in the Quran, in the verse that he cited, says that the stars are a means of protection for God. Allah doesn't need anyone's protection, especially not from created things within His creation. So this is a basic fundamental mistake. And then where God resides, Allah does not reside anywhere, and He certainly does not reside in a council or assembly with angels. So this is something that the masked Arab is imagining, and he clearly, he's thinking about Zeus or some kind of Greek pantheon with the gods, just sitting in an assembly, in a council. Or maybe he's thinking of Star Wars. I don't know. This doesn't have any bearing on Islamic theology, and it's a very basic mistake that he's making that indicates that he doesn't understand Islam. And then the other thing is that he's saying that the stars have only these two purposes according to the Quran. Again, nowhere in the ayat, in the verses that he cites, is that stated, that the stars only have these two purposes that he states. And then also he makes that same fundamental error that we talked about, where he's assuming that the language of contemporary science is the only way to describe reality. Okay? When in fact, in Arabic, there are different words used in the Quran for lights in the sky. So he doesn't make those kinds of distinctions when he's translating these verses. So there's kawakib, there's nujum, shihab. All of these different terms refer to different phenomenon, and this is the Quranic vocabulary. So why should we throw out that vocabulary and adopt the vocabulary of modern science? So he's not justifying that, he's simply presuming that. And so that's a form of circular reasoning and begging the question. He's assuming that the Islamic language and the Quranic language is false, and as evidence for his overall claim in this video of proof for why Islam is false, reasons why I left Islam. So he's arguing in a circle, and we're going to see this over and over again in his video. All right, so let's continue.
The stars are pelted at devils trying to listen in to what's being said in the heavens. Now there are two main problems here beside the obvious absurdity and mythical nature of this story. The first is that shooting stars are not actually stars but meteors. And the second is these meteors burn in the layer of the atmosphere just above Earth called the mesosphere. It's clearly an ancient legend that tries to explain why they were shooting stars to primitive people who didn't understand the world around us.
So yeah, he's begging the question. He's saying that this is clearly a primitive myth. Okay, why? Because he's not able to correlate exactly the modern astronomical jargon in terms, the difference between stars and meteors and meteorites, asteroids and so forth, with the vocabulary of the Quran. But again, this goes back to the first two questions that I showed you. The first question, does science have the complete reality? Okay, that's one question. And if it does, if we concede that, then why should only that language be used to describe reality? In fact, some theoretical physicists will say that you can't even use English to describe reality because mathematics is the true language of reality. So if you really want to talk about the way the universe works and how the cosmos functions, you have to use math. Actually, you have to use field equations and tensors and all of these kinds of mathematical concepts and formula. That's the only way. So this is something that we have to appreciate when we look at how science can inform us about the nature of reality versus what revelation tells us about reality. So this is not he's not proving anything. He's not showing any clear contradiction. He's just making these assumptions and then imposing it and taking them for granted. Oh, and this was about like when he says that these are clearly primitive myths. Okay, so this is circular because you're presuming exactly what you are setting out to prove. Right? You're just giving some verses from the Quran and saying this is clearly primitive because it doesn't match exactly what we'd find in a scientific textbook. Okay? And so that's reason to think that the Quran is false and therefore Islam is false. But no, you're arguing in a circle. This is begging the question.
Reason number two. The Quran has contradictions as well as grammatical and historical errors. According to Islamic history, the first major battle the Muslims fought against the pagan Arabs were at the wells of Badr, around 130 kilometers southwest of Medina, not too far from the Red Sea. Muslims claimed their army defeated a far larger army, and Muhammad said this was due to a number of angels who came down to help them in battle. But how many angels helped the Muslims win the Battle of Badr? If we look at Surah Al-Anfal verse 9, it's 1,000. Whereas Surah Al-Imran verses 123 to 124 are clear that 3,000 angels helped the Muslims at Badr. Some apologists claim that the 3,000 angels were sent at the next battle of Uhud, but that makes no sense since the verses are clearly talking about Badr.
Okay, so he doesn't even get, the verses correct. Like, it's interesting because he doesn't cite the full verses. And I think he does that for a reason, because if you cite the entirety of the verses, then it becomes clear that there is no contradiction here. So remember when you, Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, were saying to the believers, is it not enough for you that your Lord will reinforce you with 3,000 angels sent down? Of course it's enough. In fact, if you all are steadfast and God-fearing and they rush and attack towards you, then your Lord will reinforce you with 5,000 angels bearing distinguished markings. So this is the first couple of verses he cites, and he says that this is a contradiction with the other verse. Remember when you all cried out for help from your Lord, and so you were answered thus. Indeed, I'll reinforce you with 1,000 angels, rank after rank. Okay, so this is completely, two separate instances. Okay, these verses aren't saying what the final amount of angels there were. Okay, the final number of angels that they were actually present in the Battle of Badr. Okay, so and this is actually what some of the commentators mention, and even there's a narration, okay, that is reported by Ibn Hajar, and in this narration, Ibn Anas said, Allah aided the Muslims on the day of Badr with 1,000 angels. Then he increased them in help, so there were 3,000, and then he increased them in help, so there were 5,000. So this increase was due to their steadfastness, as mentioned in the Quran, and being God-fearing, and so forth. So this is not a contradiction. None of the mufassirin, the exegetes of the Quran, took this as a contradiction, and it's clear when you read the full verse. Okay, so we're getting even more ridiculous in terms of taking things out of context. He's not even citing the full verses when he's claiming that there are contradictions in the Quran. Okay, so let's continue.
Now, how long is Judgment Day? Well, it's either 50,000 years by our count or 1,000 years by our count. It depends really on which verse you're reading.
Okay, so these verses aren't even talking about Judgment Day. So see, he's saying, he's citing this verse: the angels and the Spirit will ascend to him during a day, the extent of which is 50,000 years. Okay? Why is he thinking that this is necessarily referring to Judgment Day? And then the other verse, he rules all affairs, or he arranges all affairs from the heavens to the earth. Then it will ascend to him in a day, the extent of which is 1,000 years of which you count. So this is not necessarily referring to Judgment Day. And in one ayah, Allah is referring to angels and the Spirit, and the other he is not. So how are you interpolating, or how are you concluding that this is referring to the same thing, and therefore is a contradiction? So just a basic reading of the ayat, of the verses, shows that something funny is going on. Like he's creating contradictions by misreading the verses. Okay? Not even misinterpreting, just misreading them, and just assuming at what they are referring to. Okay, so these are not contradictions. Okay, let's continue.
1,000 years by our count. It depends. I won't get into grammatical errors here, as this.
So he says, I won't get into grammatical errors in this video. And he doesn't talk about any grammatical errors. And alhamdulillah for that, because he can't even cite verses properly, and he can't read them. Even the English translation, he can't read properly and come to a sound conclusion. So thank God that he's not going to get into supposed grammatical errors. That would just be really embarrassing.
Video is in the English language, but a blaring historical error comes in the description of Jesus' mother Mary. The author of the Quran clearly mixes up the well-known Mary with a Miriam who allegedly lived hundreds of years before her. Miriam is mentioned in the Bible as a sister of Aaron and Moses. The book of Exodus, chapter 15, verse 20, clearly says that Miriam is the sister of Aaron. She's also mentioned as the daughter of Amram, and this is mentioned in 1 Chronicles 6:3. Now the Quran mentions the Virgin Mary with exactly the same relations as Miriam. That is just way too much of a coincidence and extremely strong evidence that the Quran's author made an error after mistaking Mary and Miriam as the same person. We see in Surah At-Tahrim, which is chapter 66, verse 12, Mary is referred to as the daughter of Imran, whilst in Surah Miriam, chapter 19, verse 28, she's referred to as a sister of Aaron. The author has clearly mistaken Miriam for Mary in the Bible and presented them as the same person in the Quran.
Okay, so 2 points here. First of all, with all Semitic languages, okay, saying that someone is the sister of someone or the brother of someone or the daughter or the son of someone does not necessarily mean a literal brother, sister, father, daughter, etc. Okay, and anyone who's familiar with Semitic languages or anyone who reads other verses of the Quran understands this. Biblical scholars even refer to this. So, in the Quran itself, other prophets are named as akhahum, meaning the brother of them, brother of the people. So, akhahum Salih, akhahum Hud, akhahum Shu'aib, for example. Their brother. It's not referring to a literal blood relation, that they're literally the brother of all of these people, this entire village or town or civilization. This is just the way that Semitic languages work. Or it can refer to a distant patriarch as well. So saying that Mary, the Virgin Mary alayhi salam, is from Imran, the family of Imran. Okay? That's referring to, doesn't mean literally that this is the daughter of Imran, okay, that she's the daughter of Imran. It can mean that that is her lineage. And again, we see this very clearly in Semitic languages, in Hebrew, Aramaic, and also in Arabic, and things like Bani Israel. Okay, Bani Israel is very common, meaning the children of Israel. Israel meaning Yaqub, the prophet Yaqub, Jacob. Or Bani Adam, the children of Adam. It doesn't mean Adam, the prophet. Adam is literally the father, the direct father of all of humanity. No, it means he is the patriarch. He is the patriarch of all humanity. So this is a very weak objection from the masked Arab. And he's borrowing from some of the old Orientalists, okay, who claim that the Quran is copying from the Bible and is plagiarizing from the Bible. So this kind of argument has been refuted many times, and it's just tiresome when you hear the same thing. Also, I mean, this idea that he's promoting here, that the author of the Quran is mixing up Miriam in the Bible with Mary, the mother of Isa, the mother of Jesus. How does that even work? How does that make sense? Because when you look at Miriam in the Bible, what's described in the Old Testament is that she is the sister, literally the sister of Aaron and Moses. And, she has all these different details in her life, but none of those details involve having children. None of those details involve like a virgin birth. None of those details involve any of the things that happen to Mary, right? So why would it be a plagiarism of the Old Testament? Why would the Prophet ﷺ, on the assumption of this murtad, he is just making it up and he's plagiarizing, why would he not include those details but include the details of Mary's lineage? Why would he copy certain parts and not copy other parts, right? And why would he copy the parts that are so sensitive? Because when it comes to Mary and Jesus, this is something very sensitive, because Jesus is the son of Mary and he does not have a father. He was born without a father. So this is his lineage is very important. So according to the masked Arab, the Prophet ﷺ is plagiarizing just that detail that would be the most sensitive and that critics would be the most keen on, and doesn't plagiarize anything else and doesn't mix up anything else with the actual life of this biblical person, Miriam. So that doesn't really make sense. And it shows that he's, this is just confirmation bias. This is just cherry picking and trying to weave a coherent narrative of plagiarism and copying when none really exists. And also the whole idea of plagiarizing from the Bible, why should we assume that? Why does masked Arab take that as a given? That the Prophet ﷺ, peace be upon him, was just plagiarizing the Bible. Just because the Quran contains similar narratives, okay, as the Bible, that doesn't mean that it's plagiarism. And so we're gonna get into more details on that later in the video. All right, let's continue.
On to reason 3, the life and actions of Muhammad. Now, before I'm accused of cherry picking on this, I will say I am aware that he did do some good things, like encouraging charity giving to the poor, for instance, and forbidding backbiting. The most well-known controversy involving him was probably his marriage to a 6-year-old girl before consummating the marriage at 9.
Okay, so this is the first issue that he mentions as proving that the Prophet ﷺ acted immorally. A lot of the enemies of Islam and Murtads will point to this, the age of Aisha and her marriage to the Prophet ﷺ. So I think that this is very easily addressed, and I would have to, create a whole new video to just focus on this, to give all the details. But I just want to mention a few points. First of all, this was a common practice in every culture. Every pre-industrial, pre-modern culture, this was a very common practice. And so no one ever pointed this marriage of the Prophet ﷺ to Aisha radiallahu anha as something immoral or something that was problematic. And you have to really understand what the practice really is, okay, of marrying, of a man, older man marrying or having sex with a 9-year-old or 10-year-old prepubescent girl. And the thing is that in the vast majority of history, life expectancy was relatively low, infant mortality was considerably high, and so therefore it was necessary to use the extent of the fertility window for reproduction. What do I mean by fertility window? Women have only a certain number of years where they can have children and reproduce. And it can start as early as 9 years old, 8 years old, and extends to about mid-30s or up to 40. So given the high mortality rate, the high infant mortality rate, the low life expectancy, it's important to use that in the entirety of that window. And what psychologists say today, evolutionary psychologists, say that this practice is actually evolutionarily adaptive. Okay? That this is something that is adaptive if we consider Darwinian evolution. I don't accept Darwinian evolution, that's a whole different topic. But for some of these atheists who do accept evolution, then this is something that was practiced and it was considered evolutionarily adaptive. And there's a strong moral reason for it as well, because when you have a society where all of labor is manpower, and in fact your survival as a people, as a family, as a village, as a nation depends on your numbers, right? Do you have enough people to sustain the amount of labor that's required to survive pre-industrial times? Do you have enough children who can fight if there are invaders, who can defend your tribe, defend your city, so forth? Then it becomes very important to make sure that you have enough children And if you are waiting, right, if in your tribe you're waiting until 18 to start having children, and your enemies are having children at a much younger age, they're able to have more children. They'll be able to have bigger armies, and then those bigger armies are going to wipe out you and your tribe. Right? So this is something that is evolutionarily adaptive. And even if you don't accept evolution, then this is something that has a strong moral basis. And that's why it was so widely practiced across cultures in the past, and even in certain cultures today. And so this issue of whether this is pedophilia, right, for a man, an older man, to marry and start having children, start having relations with prepubescent child, there is a controversy on whether this is considered pedophilia. A large number of contemporary psychologists said no, this is a separate category. And you can read the paper by psychologist Bruce Rind. Okay, Bruce Rind, and he uses the term hebephilia. Hebephilia, and what that means is sexual attraction to prepubescent, around the age of 9, 10, 11, prior to when there is that moment of puberty. Okay, so in that window, the female is capable of having sexual relations. So this is hebephilia. It's a completely different term. And what Bruce Rind argues in this peer-reviewed published paper is that this cannot be considered psychologically dysfunctional in and of itself. It can't be considered psychologically dysfunctional in and of itself because it's evolutionarily adaptive. Because this is how, if we're defining health as what is going to be good for you, what's going to be good for your genes, what's going to be good for the human race, then you can't say that this is psychologically dysfunctional. And what he concludes, he says that if we look at cross-culture, if we look at sociological, if we look at even other species, we look at all of the empirical evidence, we can't consider this psychologically problematic. It's only a issue because of the taboo associated with the cultural taboo, right? So this is how we can address this issue. And the people who want to use this as an attack against the Prophet ﷺ and Islam, they're just going for the shock factor. It's like, oh my God, he married a 9-year-old. What is, that is so disgusting, and so forth. So okay, so justify that. Why is that inherently wrong? Given everything that I just said about fertility window, the practices of all of these cultures and societies, the mortality rate, and so on and so forth. Okay? Where is the harm? Where is the harm that is caused? And they'll say that, well, there's psychological harm to a child. But what is the evidence for that? What is the evidence? Is the psychological harm of a child? I agree that within today's society in the West, where it is taboo and where this is something that the only time someone is having sex with children is in a closet. I mean, that's the disgusting way that Westerners are practicing hebephilia. Because it's socially taboo, they have to hide, and you have priests behind closed doors basically molesting children. That's not the same as marriage. That's not the same as a society where this is acceptable and parents understand and children understand, and it's known that, okay, you're entering a life of marriage. It's all above board. So there's no harm. Those individuals, those children in those families, in those societies, in those cultures are not psychologically harmed. The only psychological harm that we see in the West is because there's abuse happening because of the taboo. So this is, again, circular reasoning. You assume that it is taboo and that it's harmful and then it's disgusting. And then the psychological harm is because of that taboo that you are expressing, that you are acknowledging from your own culture. So this is circular reasoning, and we don't see that kind of taboo, we don't see that kind of harm in other societies. And even in my own family, when I look at my great grandmother, she was married when she was 12, right? And she was perfectly functional and lived a very long and happy life with many children. And this was something that was not seen as strange. In fact, it was very common in the Middle East, in many cultures. So this is an easy argument to make, and I can't really elaborate it. I did do a whole seminar on this issue. If you're interested, check alesna.org, Alesna Institute, my online teaching academy. And there's an entire seminar, almost 3-hour seminar on this topic, going in all these details. So if you're interested, you can check that out. But let's continue.
Muhammad was a violent man who led at least 30 raids against his opponents and encouraged banditry against trade caravans where his men looted goods and killed traveling merchants. The attacks were unprovoked the vast majority of the time.
Right, so I don't know how he's coming up to the conclusion that the attacks were unprovoked, right? The raids against different caravans, this is just a function of war. Whenever two countries or two nations are at war, part of war is to hit supply lines, to attack supply lines. Okay, so when you have the Quraysh and other tribes that are allying with the Quraysh, attacking the Muslims, trying to destroy and annihilate and exterminate the Muslims, so this is a state of war. And within the state of war, it is valid and considered by even modern international law to attack trade lines, right, and supply lines and so forth. So to say that this was unprovoked is kind of a stretch.
In some raids, Muslims attacked villages, killing the men and enslaving women and children. At the beginning of verse 24, we see it says, "Also prohibited are women already married, except those whom your right hands possess." So we can clearly see that Muhammad and the Quran encouraged Muslim soldiers to rape their female captives, even if they were married.
All right, so this is the issue of concubinage, slave girls. Again, it's a big topic that I address in other sources and other places like alesna.org. But again, this was not seen as a problem. All of the cultures within history have practiced this, of taking concubines from defeated enemies. And again, the logic of it and the morality of it is very easy to understand, because your existence and your ability to fight an enemy and ward off enemies is because of the size, or is primarily tied to the size of your army. Okay, in most cases, the bigger army, whoever has the bigger army is going to win, right? And so how do you get a bigger army? You need manpower, and one of the main ways to get manpower is to assimilate places that you or enemies that you defeat. Assimilate them by either marrying or taking the concubines, and so that you can have more reproductive power, you can have more children, and therefore have a bigger city, more population, and that's going to be able to help you defend and protect yourself against invaders and those who want to conquer you and defeat you and exterminate you. So this is a matter of life and death. This is an existential threat, and so it's necessary to practice something like concubinage, and to take the children and take women and assimilate them into your society through marriage. And so it's very clear logic, and it's hard to see why that would be considered moral when the life of your entire society depends on this practice. Okay? So this is, again, a much larger discussion, but this is, you can begin to see how this is not really a big problem against Islam. And, all societies, amongst all religions, were practicing this at the same time. I mean, it's like if you told people that, it's immoral to use horses for battle. Like, that's an innocent animal. How can you ride a horse onto battle and risk the death of that poor innocent animal? This is completely immoral. Well, horses were necessary within these battles, within these wars, and whoever had the most horses has a better chance of winning. And if the life of your entire society is at stake, then the riding a horse is not going to outweigh that moral consideration. So, same idea.
Muhammad was also obsessed with the Jews. He initially felt he could convince them to join him and accept his prophethood, but they kept insisting for miracles that he couldn't provide. So he became increasingly frustrated with them and began to come up with reasons to attack them, banish them, and take over their wealth and property.
All right, so he's citing all of these ayat, all of these verses, but what do these verses say? None of them talk about Jews asking for miracles and then the Prophet ﷺ being frustrated with them. So I don't know where he's getting that from. Okay? He's just saying that, Jews asked the Prophet ﷺ for miracles and he couldn't provide it and he got frustrated. That's not what those verses say. None of them. And what he's referring to are verses like, and for example, if he says verse 13:7, and those who disbelieve say, why has not a sign been sent down to him from his Lord? You are only a warner, and for every people is a guide. So these ayat are actually referring to disbelievers who are demanding signs, but signs are given to them and miracles are shown to them, and they still persist on their disbelief. That's what these verses are referring to. Okay? And anyway, this doesn't even make sense, like what he's saying. He's saying that these verses are about Jews asking the Prophet ﷺ for miracles, and then he gets frustrated because he can't provide them. So if, according to the masked Arab, the Prophet ﷺ is fabricating the Quran, he's just making it up, why would he include that? Why would he even include that in the Quran? Why would he include that he's being frustrated that he can't perform miracles? Why would he, advertise that as his failure? So it doesn't even meet like a basic logic test. Okay. Let's continue.
He banished a couple of Jewish tribes from Medina, but then the third and final tribe weren't as fortunate. The Banu Qurayza had been accused of not doing enough to support Muhammad in his battles, and he besieged their fortress for 25 days with no food or water allowed in before they were forced to surrender.
Right, then here again, he's talking about they're unprovoked, as if the Prophet ﷺ and the Muslims were just randomly attacking a tribe of Jews, like just because they're so violent and barbaric. This is a complete misrepresentation of what actually happened. Okay? When it came to Banu Qurayza, specifically, they broke their treaty. They committed the most treacherous act possible. Basically, the Quraysh, the Mushrikeen, the main enemies of the Prophet ﷺ and the Muslims, were attacking Medina in the Battle of the Trench. And so the Muslims were holding off these attackers from one side of Medina, from one side of the city. And then they had made an agreement with Banu Qurayza, with this Jewish tribe, to basically protect the other flank of the city. But then they, in a treacherous way, broke that agreement, and collaborated with the Quraysh so that the Quraysh can go from the back of the city, from the other side, and basically trap the Muslims. And so this was an extremely treacherous act that was meant to completely annihilate and destroy and exterminate the Muslims, right? So that kind of treachery was what happened. It wasn't an unprovoked, a conflict where the Muslims were just trying to be hostile towards this innocent tribe. No, they had committed the utmost form of treachery that was with the intention of annihilating the Muslims and collaborating with those who wanted to annihilate Muslims. This is, clear act of war. So, but masked Arab completely ignores all those details and says, oh, this was, innocent Jewish tribe, unprovoked. The Muslims and the Prophet ﷺ are so bloodthirsty that they're going to attack them. Okay, let's continue.
As the Jews sat awaiting their punishment, some Muslims from the Aus tribe begged Muhammad to be lenient in his sentence, but he appointed a man known for his contempt towards the Bani Qurayza to issue a sentence against them. This man, Sa'ad ibn Mu'adh, ordered that all men and boys who have reached puberty are beheaded. Estimates of people beheaded that day range from 600 to 900 people. I ask Muslims here to be honest with themselves. If they were on the receiving end of such barbarity, would they give the same excuses that they give now for this brutal massacre?
Yeah, so he wants to ask this kind of question, and all that I'll say is that the punishment fits the crime, right? You want to act that kind of treacherously, and attack the Muslims in this kind of way in war at such a sensitive moment and put the entire Muslim ummah in danger of annihilation. Okay, so there's a consequence for that, right, in war, and everyone recognizes that, and there's no disagreement on standards of just warfare and practices within war. That's what war is. So punishment fits the crime. They acted like that and they got the just punishment. And even the Prophet ﷺ, as he butchers the story, but what he did was he appointed someone who was familiar with Banu Qurayza and who was familiar with the Torah and their book, the Old Testament, and he ruled and gave the punishment according to their own book. So what could be more just and fair than that? So yeah, if I don't understand why some of these atheists and apostates bring up Banu Qurayza. Like, that doesn't even have the slightest bit of moral difficulty for Muslims. It's not hard to explain at all.
Another example of extreme violence endorsed by Muhammad is given as the context behind verse 533. If we read the verse, it says, "The punishment of those who wage war against Allah and His Messenger and strive with might and main for mischief through the land is execution or crucifixion or the cutting off of hands and feet from opposite sides or exile from the land. That is their disgrace in this world, and a heavy punishment is theirs in the hereafter." Now, many Muslims will always claim that this is out of context and it obviously means something else. So let's just take a look at the context. Let's see why this particular verse came down into the Quran. Now pay attention here, as this pretty much single-handedly proves that Muhammad himself was not a man of peace.
Alright, so just we can stop here and ask, who says the Prophet ﷺ was a man of peace? Is this something that's coming from Islam itself? No. Okay. I know that there are some Muslims who will push this kind of inaccurate portrayal of the Prophet ﷺ, but it's not the case. The Prophet ﷺ was not a pacifist. Okay? He was not a pacifist. He was, in certain circumstances, a warrior. In certain circumstances, he was a general of war. Okay? Islam is a religion of justice. Islam is a religion of a life. Okay? And life sometimes requires violence, war. right? Do people not recognize this? I don't understand how atheists or this masked Arab or apostates can criticize Islam for violence or criticize the Prophet, peace be upon him, for violence when the modern world is replete with all kinds of violence. You know, how can you criticize the Prophet ﷺ, but then you have, you know, this heroic vision of or impression of people like George Washington, you know, or General Patton, or, you know, Eisenhower or Roosevelt, or any of these war presidents, okay, who are generals of war? And isn't it patriotic? And don't we have, you know, the armed forces, and we have to support our troops? And all of this, the understanding is that, yeah, this is violence, but it's justified violence. So you don't have a problem with violence. You're criticizing the Prophet ﷺ for violence, but then you're glorifying violence when it comes to the secular state and when it comes to certain sanctioned forms of violence. Even the police, right? Police have to be violent, don't they? Police have to enforce the law. If you want to enforce justice, if you want to have justice, you need to have police, and you need to have violence. Police have to act violently, right? So these two things go hand in hand, justice and violence. So how can you recognize this implicitly when it comes to modern society, but then criticize the Prophet ﷺ, peace be upon him, for that, and criticize Islam for acknowledging the reality of this? This is just more indication that Islam is the truth, and that other religions that are pacifist or don't have this same kind of ideas and concepts, this is evidence that they're not true, or that they're not applicable, or they're not universal. So I don't understand this claim that, the Prophet ﷺ was not a man of peace. Well, yeah, I agree. And again, let me just clarify so that people don't take it out of context. If there is the opportunity for peace and justice, yeah, that would be the best situation. And I'm not saying that the Prophet ﷺ did not prefer something like that, where you are able to have justice and peace. But again, if you want to have justice, sometimes that requires violence. So, and this is something that, again, everyone acknowledges and recognizes, but for some reason you want to make a big deal about the wars and the ghazawat and battles of the Prophet ﷺ.
One day, a group of people from Ukal and Urayna approached Muhammad and asked for help. He sent one of his companions with them, along with camels, and told them that they could drink camel milk and urine on their journey. Once they were far enough from Muhammad, the people killed the companion and stole the camels. However, Muhammad sent out for them and captured them. Then he personally committed one of the worst acts of violence imaginable. He chopped off their hands and feet, then gouged their eyes out before leaving them there to die in the desert a slow and painful death. This is absolutely outrageous and flies in the face of swift justice.
Okay, again, punishment fits the crime. I don't see any moral problem. You described how these criminals ambushed a man and killed him and stole from him. Okay, this is, according to some, an act of war even. Okay, this is brigandry. And so, according to Islamic law, there is a had for that. Okay, that is a death sentence. And so they're all collaborating. But even outside of the moral parameters of Islamic law, people recognize that these are people who collaborated to kill in cold blood an innocent person. So they should be punished. And in certain circumstances, like this kind of treachery, it is so significant that, yeah, a brutal punishment is actually justified. So it deters this kind of behavior. It deters this kind of treachery and murder, cold-blooded murder. So there's nothing that bothers me, even in the slightest. And if it bothers you, then, I mean, there must be some kind of issue with your morality.
Reason number 4. The Quran takes many absurd and historically inaccurate stories from the Bible. For starters, there is no
Okay, let me just comment on this before we get into his points. What I was mentioning before, why do we have to think that just because the Bible and the Quran have the same stories or similar stories, that this means that the Quran has plagiarized from the Bible? And the example that I always give is that you have many history books that all mention George Washington, that all mention the Revolutionary War, that all mention, the forming of the Constitution. All of these books are saying the same exact thing. Does that mean that they plagiarized from each other, or that they're all plagiarizing from one source? No. It just means that these were historical events, that these things happened, and that different sources are narrating those events from reality. And that's the case with Islam. That's the case with the Quran. The Bible, as Muslims acknowledge, that the original uncorrupted Bible was revelation from God, where God is telling about the stories of different prophets so that we take their example and we emulate them and we learn from their lives. Okay? So those stories are relevant, some of them throughout human history. And so they're reaffirmed in the Quran. It's not evidence that the Quran is plagiarizing. Right? So if you just assume off the bat that these are being plagiarized from the Bible, then again, you're begging the question. You're assuming your conclusion that Islam is false and that the Quran is plagiarized. You're assuming that, you're starting with that, and then you're using that as evidence. You're using that as evidence for your overall point of proof why Islam is false. So this is a circle. So let's continue.
Geological evidence around for a global flood like Noah's, even though there should be plenty of evidence for such a flood if it really happened.
All right, so the first thing he says, there's no evidence for a global flood as mentioned in the Bible and also mentioned in the Quran. So, first of all, the idea of a global flood is not necessarily shared by all of the mufassirin of the Quran, by all of the exegetes. Some of them said that it was not global, it was local, a local flood that affected the people of Noah, alayhi salam. So that's one point. But even if we assume that it was a global flood, is it true that there is no archaeological evidence for this? No, there is evidence, okay? And there's different things I'll cite for you. First of all, Robert Ballard, one of the world's best-known underwater archaeologists, has said that there is evidence of a major flood, and he cites the fact that the Black Sea in the past used to be fresh water, and then at one particular point in history, about 5000 BC, it suddenly becomes salt water. And he says that what possibly explains this, is that there was so much ice within a particular ice age of that time. Ice that was 1 mile thick, over New York City, for example, or Chicago, in these parts of the globe. And that ice melted, and that created a huge flood that pushed ocean water and water in the Mediterranean into the Black Sea and made it into salt water. And he actually did an analysis of fossils and different debris within the subsurface around the coast of the Black Sea. And he has archaeological evidence to prove that this was something that could have happened around 5000 BC. So Robert Ballard, this is archaeological evidence. And then there's other evidence as well. Recently, scientists have confirmed that underneath the crust of the earth, there is a lot of water. Enough water to fill 3 times as much as what is currently in the oceans of the earth. So you have all of this water that, if it were on the surface, could cover the entire globe underwater. Okay, so this is evidence, and those scientists acknowledge that at some point this water could have been on the surface at some point, And different kinds of geological events could have changed whether that water is on the surface or underneath the surface. So there's plenty of archaeological evidence for this, or even with Mars, right? This is something that just came to me right now. You have the astronomers and those who analyze the surface of Mars, the planet Mars, that they are hypothesizing that there are oceans of water underneath the surface of Mars. And they think that there is good evidence for that based on the probes that they've sent to the Martian surface. And so it's possible that even though the surface of the planet is relatively dry in the current moment, it doesn't mean that historically there wasn't a significant amount of water on the surface of the planet. So this is all evidence. So when the masked Arab says that, just definitively, again, asserting that, oh, there's no archaeological evidence. Okay, well, you clearly are not well read enough to understand that there is evidence of this. And so you're deliberately turning away from that. All right, let's continue.
No historical evidence whatsoever that Jews were enslaved in Egypt at any time. No archaeological proof suggests that they were lost in the desert for 40 years. Yet elements of this story appear quite a lot in the Quran.
All right, so he's saying that there's no evidence that the Jews were enslaved in Egypt or that they were lost in the desert for 40 years, as mentioned in the Bible and mentioned in the Quran. So, very simple point. Absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. This is a very clear, logical point. And furthermore, there are so many gaps in the archaeological record. And the only reason that you think that, oh, there's no archaeological evidence for this, therefore it's false, is if you think that the archaeological record is complete. And that's not the case. It is very incomplete. There are major gaps, and there are major new discoveries being made about Egypt every year. In fact, just earlier this year, in February of 2019, dozens of new mummies and new tombs were discovered in Egypt. Okay? So who knows what else that might be discovered in the future that would have that kind of evidence of the Jews being enslaved as described in the Quran and described in the Bible. And then there are other examples of how the archaeological record can have major gaps. This is something that I learned in history class when I was in high school studying American history, and maybe you've heard of it. It's about the lost colony of Roanoke. And this was in 1587 that a colony, English colony, was established off the coast of North Carolina. Okay? And then the governor of this colony, after he established the colony in 1587, he returned to England, and then he came back after 2 years. And when he came back, there was no trace of the colony. Absolutely no trace. And this was, not just one or two people. This was, between 100 and 200 colonizers who had formed this colony on this island. And so within 2 years, there was no archaeological, or there's no trace of them. And even to this day, there's no definitive conclusion of what happened to this colony. Where did they go? You would expect that there'd be some archaeological evidence, that there'd be some traces of them in terms of their homes that they built and their clothes and different kinds of artifacts like that. But there's no artifacts, and researchers to this day do not know what has happened to this colony. And so they call it the lost colony of Roanoke. And this was 1587. This is not even thousands of years ago. So even according to modern archaeology and research, you can have entire peoples that are off of the archaeological record, even though we know that they existed. Okay? So this is a basic point. There's another point, another logical point. So this masked Arab is saying that why isn't there no evidence of Jews being enslaved by Pharaoh? Why? But think about it. Think about the principle of history is written by the victors. History is written by the victors. Why would the Egyptians record the fact that they were defeated and they were embarrassed, right? And their Pharaoh was killed and died and drowned. Why would they record this event? It would be an embarrassment, right? That this ragtag group of Jews and Israelites completely undermined their system of government and got the better of them. Why would they record that? And the Jews, okay, that are the Israelites, Beni Israel, that are now in the desert, they're not going to have a record either. They're lost in the desert, and they just have the tradition that's passed on. And so that exists, but why are you expecting an archaeological record like that when history is written by the victors? Okay, so these are some of the basic points that you can make to that.
Let's take a look now at Jacob. He is also known by the name Israel in both the Bible and the Quran. Let's take a look at where he gets this name. In Genesis 32, we are told Jacob physically wrestles with God during the night until dawn. Then God tried to escape Jacob's grip, but it was too strong, and Jacob said he wouldn't let him go unless he blessed him. God then blesses him and renames him Israel, which in Hebrew means he who prevails over God. Why on earth would the Quran use the name Israel to describe Jacob if this is the name's origin in the Bible?
So again, it's just really tiresome, these kinds of arguments, because it's like a fifth grader who just reads something online and then tries to come up with a refutation. It's a very superficial knowledge. In fact, within biblical studies, there is a disagreement on this. Most of the biblical scholars don't say that the verses he's referring to is Jacob wrestling with God. They say that's Jacob wrestling with an angel. Okay, so that's a whole different conversation. But it seems like masked Arab is not even aware of these kinds of biblical disputes. Also, the name Israel, there is a discussion among biblical scholars on what is really the etymological root of Israel. Does it mean struggle with God? Does it mean the upright of God? The Abarim Biblical Dictionary gives that definition, that Israel actually means upright of God, or the one who is steadfast of God. So this is biblical scholarship that masked Arab is completely ignorant of. And then in Islam, Israel, this is something that we do find the exegetes and the scholars of Islam do share a narration from Ibn Abbas, one of the companions of the Prophet ﷺ, who relates that Israel means Abdullah. It means the servant or the slave of God. Okay? So this is not, it's not that Islam is taking a blasphemous name and incorporating it. So this is all just in this guy's imagination. He doesn't know what he's talking about.
Another bizarre story that is copied from the Bible is the story of Lot, where he hosts two angels in his home, and a homosexual mob demand Lot hand them over to be raped. Lot, instead, being the good man he is, offers his two virgin daughters for the mob to rape instead. Luckily for the girls, the homosexual mob declined Lot's insane offer. This is mentioned in Genesis 19, but it's also mentioned twice in the Quran. Firstly in Surah Hud, chapter 11, verse 78, and also in Surah Al-Hijr, chapter 15, verse 71.
So this is like a bad faith argument. He's arguing against Lut alayhi salam and what's mentioned within the Quran, where Lut, here I'll read you the ayat. And when our messengers came unto Lut, he was distressed and knew not how to protect them. He said, this is a distressful day. And his people, meaning Qawm Lut, came to him, running towards him. And before then, they used to commit abominations, meaning same-sex behavior. And then Lut said, O my people, here are my daughters, they are pure for you. Here are my daughters, they are pure for you. And so this is bad faith, what masked Arab is doing, and these other atheists are saying, oh, see, this means that Lut wants to sacrifice his daughters to be raped by this mob, by this angry mob. See, oh, how barbaric. Oh, this is nonsense, right? All of the exegetes and anyone who commented on these verses from the beginning noted that what is referred to here is that Lut is speaking generally about his daughters, and we've referred to this earlier in the video when we said that in Semitic languages, referring to your daughter or your sister or your father doesn't necessarily mean a literal blood relation, like he's literally offering his actual daughters. Rather, he's saying that my daughters, meaning I'm the father, I'm the patriarch of this town. My daughters, women, why are you approaching men with lust and with desire instead of my daughters, instead of women, to marry them, right? So this is what all of the mufassirin, the interpreters of the Quran, have recorded and they've said. But this is a bad faith argument from the masked Arab to say, oh, well, that's so convenient, right? That's all his argument amounts to. Like, oh, just like scoffing. Oh, this is just so convenient. Okay, that's not an argument, right? Just rolling your eyes is not an argument. If you want to argue in bad faith, then we can call you out and say that this is not really strong evidence of a moral problem or whatever else that you're trying to argue against Islam.
Reason number 5, the pagan origins of belief. Islam seems to take a lot of what pagans used to believe. Let's remember that the Sumerian religion was likely the first organized religion in the region and possibly the entire world.
Evidence, what is the evidence that the Sumerian religion was the first? He used these kinds of weasel words, like it likely was, or this is probably the case. Okay, what's the proof of that? If you're trying to make this logical argument against Islam, then you have to do better than that.
They believed in the concept of 7 heavens and 7 earths. They had a superstition with the number 7 because of what they observed about the night sky, where 7 objects, namely the sun, moon, and 5 inner planets of the solar system, all moved independently and were not fixed like the stars appear to be. Surah Al-Talaq, chapter 65, verse 12 reads, Allah is He who created 7 firmaments, and on the earth a similar number. Now, we obviously know now that there aren't 7 earths or 7 heavens, but even if someone claims we might not know the meaning, isn't it dubious to say the least that this idea was proposed well before the Quran stated it? I mean, it was an incorrectly held common belief long before the 7th century that there were 7 heavens.
Let's see.
Right.
So this point that he's making, like, what is the evidence for it? He's talking about these pagan religions, like the Sumerian religion. He's saying that, well, they have these ideas of 7 heavens. They have these notions that are found in the Quran and Islam. So that means, again, that they plagiarized and they stole it and they adapted it. Again, this is logically incoherent. Like, it doesn't follow that if you find within Islam a practice that is also found in another religion, that Islam copied it or plagiarized from it or is adapted from it, right? This is a logical error because the Islamic narrative and the Islamic history is that Islam was the original religion, that the first human being, Adam, was a Muslim, submitted to God, to his creator. And so Islam is the original religion, and then that religion was corrupted with polytheism and paganism over time. And so if you have a corrupted ideology, it's going to have certain aspects that were found in the original religion, which is Islam. Okay? So this is the Islamic interpretation and understanding of history and the explanation of these similarities between certain practices that might be found in other religions and Islam. So what evidence is this masked Arab really providing? What evidence is he providing? You can't just say that, oh, look, the Sumerian religion had 7 heavens. Okay, so that means that Islam took from the Sumerian religion. That just doesn't follow.
Typical paganistic ritual is animal sacrifice to the gods. If Allah is so different from these other gods, why does he accept animal sacrifices? There are endless references to animal sacrifices in the Bible, but the Quran also has a couple of occasions when animal sacrifices to God is mentioned. Even the concept of Judgment Day and the afterlife seems borrowed from the pagans. The ancient Egyptians, for instance, had souls being judged by a god on a set of scales before determining whether they go to a fiery hell or forever abode in the beautiful gardens of heaven. Religious studies academics tell us these beliefs were held way before the advent of monotheism. We see here the reference to scales is similar to the Quran, and the idea of heaven and hell is not too far off either.
All right, so again, he's just begging the question over and over and over again. Why should we think that paganism came first? Again, like what is proving that? And he just made some hand-waving gestures to some religious studies. He doesn't provide a source for those claims, and when you go and look on his YouTube video, the description doesn't have that evidence. So I don't know where he's getting that. It's you do have there's no definitive narrative that yes, definitely this is the first religion that came, that human civilization, that human beings practiced. Yes, it was definitely paganistic. This is just a hypothesis of some of these religious scholars, and it could go either way according to them. They're agnostic about it, but masked Arab is portraying like, no, this is the definite conclusion and there's no denying it. Okay, he hasn't really shown that. But I mean, to point to animal sacrifice, and you have animal sacrifice in Islam, and then you have it in paganistic religions. This means that Islam is taken from those religions. Again, this is arguing in a circle, right? So which came first? Did the paganism come first, or did Islamic monotheism come first? Okay, it could be either, as far as the secular sciences and secular academia is concerned. There's no definite conclusion that definitively proves either way. Okay, but he just asserts that no, paganism came first, and the Islamic narrative that Islam is the original religion, that Islam came first, he just presumes that that's false, right? And he uses that presumption in his overall argument for why Islam is false. So he's just assuming what he's trying to prove. This is called begging the question constantly. He's hiding his assumptions. And his presumptions, and so people can't easily tell that he's arguing in a circle. But for those who have studied philosophy, such as myself, those who have studied these kinds of styles of argumentation and so forth, can easily point out these kinds of reasoning errors. Okay, so we're getting to the last sections.
Reason number 6 that I'm no longer a Muslim is the concept of divine justice is flawed. When you have a God who vows to place you in eternal hellfire if you simply don't believe in his existence, that in itself is not very just, given he created you with a mind that used rational reasoning to reach a conclusion based on evidence you have.
All right, so this is divine injustice, supposedly. So I tried to break down his argument to understand, like, what exactly is he saying. And so this is what I came up with. He's creating this kind of two-premise argument. There's two premises and a conclusion. And this is how it goes. First premise, it's unjust to punish someone for a crime if they're ignorant of the evil of their crime. That's premise one. Premise two, God punishes people who are ignorant of him because they lack the evidence to believe in him, and therefore they're also ignorant of the evil of their disbelief. Therefore, God is unjust. And if God is unjust, that means that the concept of divine justice and the very concept of God is flawed. And that's why we have to reject God. So this is the basic argument, but this is not a sound argument. Okay, and it's very easy to see why. Premise one, it is not sound. It is unjust to punish someone for a crime if they're ignorant of the evil of their crime. Is this really an excuse? Like, if you have someone who commits a murder or commits a rape or commits a theft, for them to say, oh, I was ignorant that murdering is wrong, that molesting is wrong, that raping is wrong, that stealing is wrong. I'm just ignorant. I didn't know that this is an evil action, that this is unjust, that this is a crime. I'm ignorant. So obviously no one accepts that. If you're committing a crime, your ignorance of the law is not an excuse. This is the case in every legal system, right? Every moral system. So this premise by itself is not sound. Premise two also has problems. God punishes people who are ignorant of him because they lack the evidence and therefore are ignorant of the evil of their disbelief. So is it true that people lack evidence that God exists? No. No, there is evidence. In fact, the entire universe is evidence. Their own existence, people's own existence, is evidence that a creator exists. Everything that we see around us, and even within our own selves, this is all evidence. And these are things that a normal person should reflect on. Where did we come from? What is the purpose of our lives? Why do I have these kinds of mental states, these kinds of beliefs, these kinds of attitudes? Why do I have this moral conscience? Why do I have consciousness itself? All of these things are evidence. Evidence that is best explained by the existence of a creator. So it's not the case that people are necessarily ignorant. People might be deliberately playing dumb or deliberately trying to deny reality, deny all these signs, deny everything that they see around them and within themselves. But that's not an excuse. That's not an excuse. And so that this premise is also problematic. And so the whole argument is unsound, and we would reject it. Oh, also another point. He just has a problem, and this is common amongst atheists and people in this very entitled world that we live in, to think that, oh, why would God punish anyone? Why does God require us to believe in him? Okay? It's just unjust for that to even exist. I don't understand this kind of reasoning. You have a creator who has created you, who sustains you, who provides everything for you. Okay? Your very existence from one iota of time to the next iota of time depends on him. But you deny him, you reject him, you mock him, you pretend like he doesn't exist. How is that just? Is that justice? No. Okay? You're denying in the same way that if someone gives you your whole life, gives you the most amazing gift, gives you the most amazing blessings in your life, and then you reject and you deny it and you spit in that person's face, then we would say that, wow, you're such an ungrateful brat. You're such an entitled, ungrateful person that you deny everything that you've been given, and you feel like you're so much better. Why do I have to show any gratitude? Why should I even care? I didn't ask for any of this. That's entitlement. This is the lowest character, and shows how evil of a mindset that someone would have. So where's the justice in that? So these are things that in our entitled world, with the spread of these kinds of atheistic, anti-religious ideas, that this kind of reasoning no longer makes sense. And it's because of socialization and all of these kind of materialism that is brainwashing people to feel entitled, like they don't need to have any concern for God, let alone believing in Him and worshiping Him and so forth. Okay, continue.
Mostly unfair that some people in the past witnessed miracles firsthand, and in this day and age we no longer see them.
Right, so he's saying that it's unfair that people in the past saw miracles, and today we don't see them. Well, there's a few problems with this. First of all, miracles and seeing miracles does not guarantee faith. And this is recorded. Many of the people who saw the miracles of Moses, saw the miracles of Jesus, saw the miracles of Muhammad, peace be upon him, and peace be upon them all. They saw those miracles with their own eyes, but they continue to reject. They continue to reject the faith. They rejected God and the prophets. And then miracles of today. There could also be miracles that occur today, and there are miracles. They're not the same as prophetic miracles like splitting of the sea and so forth, but there are things that are supernatural that can happen today, and so that's not necessarily foreclosed. But whenever things like this are reported, people reject it. And these atheists say that, oh, you're just fabricating it, or people were hallucinating, or this is just doctored photos, these are just doctored videos. And so there are supernatural things that are recorded, and you can actually see them, but that doesn't serve as proof for anyone, even when it's video evidence or photographic evidence. I'm not saying that it's not possible for fabrications to exist. Sure, they do. But when it comes to, if that's the case and you're going to be skeptical of any kind of video evidence, then that means there can never be evidence of miracles happening in this day and age. And whenever people report it, you just say that they're hallucinating. You just say that they maybe were under the influence of drugs. This is how all supernatural occurrences that people report in their lives or even as a group, they're all dismissed. Okay? So then, if you're denying out of hand the possibility of miracles, then no wonder that you're not going to witness, or you think that there's no miracles that can happen in this day and age. There are many supernatural things that can occur, and I know many people who have told me, reliable, sane people who have seen these things and experienced these things in my family, and they weren't insane. In fact, they were very highly educated. And in Islam, we know you have jinn, for example, you have karamat, you have these kinds of amazing things that might happen. That's a reality. But there's never going to be evidence that the one who disbelieves will accept. So this is not really a strong argument. And then also, we do have other kinds of signs, ayat, that are just as strong, just as miraculous, all around us, the entire universe, the entire creation. These are all things that a truly rational person, an honest person, evaluates, and it serves as evidence for a creator, for God, and then even further for the truth of Islam. And so these are things that I'm not going to concede to the masked Arab and say that, yeah, there are no miracles today and there is no evidence today, and that people in the past had a better, more evidentiary basis for belief in God, so therefore that's unfair, that God has committed some kind of injustice. So I'm not going to concede that.
to the mass Arab. And then there's also signs of the last day, Asharat as-Sa'a, right? Signs of Yom al-Qiyamah, where the Prophet, peace be upon him, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, mentions things that will happen later in time, such as the competition within the Arabian Peninsula of building taller and taller buildings, right? This is one of the many prophecies of the Prophet ﷺ that are so specific, and they turn out to be exactly true. They're so specific. It's not just a general kind of prediction like, oh, there is going to be a big war, right? No, it's a very specific prediction with time, place, the people involved, what it's going to be, what it's going to look like. These are well documented within the Islamic tradition from for the past 1400 years. So are you going to accept that as miraculous knowledge that the Prophet ﷺ, peace be upon him, had? No, these atheists reject all of that and say, no, then this doesn't really prove anything, blah, 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 blah. Okay, so then you're going to dismiss everything out of hand, so then what's your point?
But what makes it worse is that in the Quran, God categorically states time and time again that guidance to his message is something that he controls and is not really a matter of free will. Chapter 2 verse 10 says, "In their hearts is a disease, and Allah has increased their disease." Why is he increasing this disease? A few verses later, we see that Allah mocks the unbelievers and leaves them to wander off blindly. In chapter 4 verse 88, the Quran is very clear. It says, "Do you wish to guide him who Allah has caused to err? And whomsoever Allah causes to err, you shall by no means find a way for him." Notice the language here. Allah is causing people to err. Allah is the cause of people erring. In chapter 16, verse 93, he causes err to whom he pleases and guides whom he pleases. So it's really down to him. It's not a matter of free will.
Alright, so again, this Master Arab is cherry-picking verses and ignoring other verses. So Allah clearly says in the Quran, indeed Allah does not do injustice even as much as an atom's weight, while if there's a good deed, he multiplies it and gives from himself a great reward. So this is just a basic premise of Islam, that God is not going to be unjust with anyone, believer or disbeliever. And Allah says elsewhere in chapter 18, and say the truth is from your Lord, so whoever wills, let him believe, and whoever wills, let him disbelieve. Okay, clearly indicating that people have the choice, people have the responsibility to believe or disbelieve. And so his portrayal of Islamic theology is very superficial, and it's kind of childish the way he's trying to portray Islam as irrational. If you're going to try to prove Islam and refute Islam, then at least do a little bit of due diligence. At least be honest and try to cover the nuances of the discussion. Try to cover the actual ayat of the Quran, because the burden is on you. You're creating this video about refuting Islam and the contradictions within Islam and the problems with Islam. So if you want to show that there's a contradiction, you have to do some work. You have to show the evidence. You have to respect what you're trying to disprove, right? Just in the same way, if I want to prove that Islam is the truth to someone, then I have work to do. I have to make a strong case, and I have to do the due diligence to do that. So in this video, the burden of proof is on the masked Arab, and he doesn't meet that burden. He's just very sloppy and deliberately will cite verses of the Quran, hadith, and so forth. And so this is just tiresome. It's not really a serious refutation of anything.
Another unjust concept is the fact that the Quran states numerous times that God had favored the Israelites over other people. What kind of universal God is this? Why would he send these people so many messengers and prophets and give them land and help them in battle? This only becomes clear when you look at the history of this God and his origins as a local God, and not as the universal God of monotheism, which he later evolves into according to detailed study of scriptures.
All right, so he's referring to the fact that Allah has said that He has His fadl on Bani Israel, His favor on Bani Israel, and again, this is, if you just look at that and then try to come up with a conclusion that, oh, this means God is unjust, He's favoring certain people over others. At the end of the day, literally the last day, Allah is not going to commit any injustice. Again, here's the verse from Surah An-Nisa. Indeed, Allah does not do injustice, even as much as an atom's weight, while if there is a good deed, He multiplies it. So the reward and punishment, this is acknowledged within within Islamic theology, among all schools of thought, is that ultimately God's judgment in the hereafter, He will take into consideration the fact, the different circumstances of a person's life. If the person had certain information or didn't have certain information, if a person had to face a harder life, if a person is poor in this life, their judgment in the afterlife will be easier. If a person was rich and believed but lived a very comfortable and rich life, then that can mean possibly that their judgment will be more severe. So it depends. It's all circumstantial, and this is part of justice. So there's not really indication of divine injustice here. And then here's the hadith that is very important from the Prophet ﷺ, collected in At-Tirmidhi. And the Prophet ﷺ is reported to have said, "O people, verily Allah has taken away from you the arrogance of jahiliyyah, of ignorance, and its pride in forefathers. People are of two types, the righteous and pious, who are dear to Allah, and doomed evildoers, who are insignificant before Allah. People are the descendants of Adam, and Allah created Adam from dust. Allah says, O mankind, indeed we have created you from the male and female, and made you peoples and tribes, that you may know one another. Indeed, the most noble of you in the sight of Allah is the most righteous. Indeed, Allah is knowing and well acquainted." So this is in the Quran, showing clearly that what matters is taqwa, what matters is righteousness and piety. And so these circumstances of where one is born, what tribe one is born in, what race one belongs to, that's not going to factor into the final judgment. We're all equal in the sense that man, woman, black, white, Arab, non-Arab, Jew, whatever, everyone has equal opportunity to be pious, to believe in Allah, to believe in His Creator, and to submit to Him and to worship Him and to accept the messengers and the final messenger, sallallahu alaihi wasallam. So this is, everyone has equal capacity for that, and God will judge everyone according to what they do with that equal capacity in the given circumstances of their life. So this is not injustice, this is perfect divine justice. And there's no proof here for proof that Islam is false because of this.
Another example of injustice can be found in chapter 2, verse 178. It reads, "Retaliation is prescribed for you in the matter of the murdered, the free man for the free man, and the slave for the slave, and the female for the female." Now, this verse isn't entirely clear from its literal reading, and we need to go and look at the context in which this verse was revealing. So let's look this up in Asbab al-Nuzul by al-Wahidi and see why this verse was revealed. Let's see, here it says, fighting took place between two Arab tribes. One Arab tribe had more power than the other, and therefore they said, "For every slave of ours that you kill, we will kill a free man of yours, and for every woman of ours, a man of yours." And then this verse was revealed. So looking at the context of Revelation, we can see that God has prescribed the barbaric practice of vengeful tribal retaliation, where if someone from tribe A kills a woman from tribe B cannot kill anyone in tribe A other than a woman in retaliation, presumably because a woman and men have varying value. What kind of divine justice is this? Innocents are killed in retaliation, and Muslim clerics tell us this system is a perfect solution for mankind.
So what is he even talking about? Qisas doesn't mean innocents are killed in retaliation. He doesn't understand qisas. He doesn't understand like this basic aspect of the Sharia and Islamic law. It doesn't mean that, oh, someone from your tribe was killed, therefore you go and kill an innocent person from the other tribe. That's not what qisas is referring to. So again, he doesn't have the basic understanding of Islam, but he thinks he understands it well enough to show that it's contradictory or that it doesn't make sense. So this is a classic straw man. He's arguing against something that is not actually a part of Islam. And again, it's very clear in the Quran, in Surah Al-Baqarah, the second chapter in the Quran, those who break God's covenant after it's ratified and who sunder what God has ordered to be joined and do mischief on earth, these cause loss only to themselves. Okay? So people who commit crimes, people who are murdering, and who are fighting and causing mischief, they bear full brunt of the responsibility for what they do. In the Sharia, it's not that, oh, someone from this tribe, just because you have a tribal affiliation, they have no part of the crime that you committed, but we're going to go and kill that person, and that's what Islamic law says. That's ludicrous. He doesn't understand the basic details of Islamic law, but he wants to make these kinds of arguments. So this is very very sad. So like this is almost 1 million people watch this joker and think that, oh, this is what Islam says.
Moving on to another point of flawed justice. It just doesn't seem like it's a fair test. I mean, people of religion will tell you that everything is a test, and it's a test whether you're going to believe or not. And if you don't believe, you fail the test and you will be punished in the hereafter. So, how fair is this? Why does a Muslim have such a massive head start on so many of us? Given that less than 1% of the world's population change their religion, this doesn't seem to be a very fair criteria. If the majority of people are unable to find the right belief using their brain, then I'm afraid God is being irrational in his judgment, as humans are clearly not capable of seeing the so-called truth of this message very easily. It's like trying to teach a class of 5-year-olds quantum mechanics, and then burning them in an eternity of hell if they don't understand it.
Okay. Yeah, I'm just getting kind of tired with this nonsense. So what was the only 1% of people change their religion? I don't know what that stat is from, and he doesn't cite it. So people change their fundamental beliefs about the world all the time. It is extremely common. I'm sure those of you who are watching have fundamentally changed your belief at some point in your life. It might not be a conversion, right, to another religion, quote unquote. It just depends on where you draw the lines of what is a religion, what is not, and what does it mean to like change your view. Okay, so you have many people who are Christian who don't think that the Bible is literally the Word of God when they get to college. They believe that the first 18 years of their life, that the Bible is literally the Word of God. Then they get to college and they change their belief. That's a huge change in belief, but they don't say that, oh, I converted out of Christianity, right? So people are changing their beliefs all the time. And then to say that Muslims have a head start, again, this is nonsense, because Muslims at all points of their lives have the opportunity to disbelieve. They can at any time leave Islam, just like at any time a non-Muslim can enter Islam. So how is this unfair? And again, when there is all this evidence around us that everyone has access to equally, we all have eyes with which to see, and hearts with which to reflect, and minds with which to conceive. We all have those abilities. So I'm not seeing exactly how this is unfair, and this goes back to the arguments that I was making earlier. What else? Yeah, and then to say that, oh, this doesn't seem like a fair test. You can say that about anything, right? Any kind of moral claim. You can say that this is unfair. For example, a person who is a pyromaniac, someone who likes to light things on fire, okay, and they have that kind of feeling, might think that, well, it's unfair that society imposes this rule that you can't set things on fire as you please. It's just not fair. How can I be held to that standard? Right? With any point of morality, with anywhere you draw the line, there can be people who say that this is unfair, that this is unfairly putting a burden on me. So if you're creative with how you negotiate those lines, then you can always make that argument about anything. So this is an argument that can be extended to anything and therefore is vacuous. Right? So we can analyze these kinds of arguments in this way. And the analogy with quantum mechanics is ludicrous. Quantum mechanics is something very specific that requires knowledge of advanced mathematics. I took quantum mechanics classes in college, and a 5-year-old couldn't do it. They don't have the capacity to be able to do quantum mechanics. But everyone has the capacity to believe. Everyone has the capacity to see and be convinced by all of the evidence of God's existence and his creation of us and his sending of messengers and prophets with a message to believe in him and to submit to him and be thankful for his blessings.
Finally, on to the last reason why I left Islam. Number 7.
Finally.
Convenient timing of verses. Muhammad had many instances of when his revelations were convenient for him on a personal level, which undoubtedly leads skeptics to question why God would be revealing verses in the Quran that have nothing to do with the message of Islam.
Alright, so this is classic argument in bad faith. It's not really an argument. So he's talking about how you have the ayat of the Quran coming in certain parts of the Prophet ﷺ's life and correlated with certain events within the seerah of the Prophet ﷺ. But this is just known. This is asbab al-nuzul. This is the reasons for revelation of certain verses. And there's nothing inherently illogical about that. There's not something inherently wrong that revelation is coming in this way to the Prophet ﷺ in specific circumstances of his life. These are just asbab al-nuzul, which it makes sense actually that the revelation comes on these different occasions. And this allows the Quran to be understood by believers as being relevant and applicable to certain real scenarios, certain real events, certain real situations. And so this is the best way to teach revelation. This is the best way to make revelation from God relevant and applicable and understandable to the finite mind of human beings. You have the perfect God, infinite God, who is sending perfect revelation. So how do our finite minds comprehend? If it were just a book that descended from the heavens, okay, that's not the best way for revelation to come. That's not the best way for us to be able to understand revelation if it were just a book that descended. No, revelation came to a man, a human being like us, in specific circumstances of his life, circumstances that we also undergo and live in the trials and travails and tribulations of life. Okay? So this is the best way. There's so much wisdom in all of this and real understanding for people. But what does this masked Arab have to say about this? All he can say is like, oh, well, that's so convenient. Oh, my God. Let me just roll my eyes at how convenient this is. That's not an argument. That's not a refutation. Okay? You're just hand-waving. You're just gesturing, and you're appealing to people's preconceived biases. Right? People who in the first place don't believe that Islam is the truth, that don't believe in revelation, that don't believe in the Prophet ﷺ, you're just appealing to their emotions and saying, oh, isn't it so convenient, guys? See? That's not an argument. It's not an argument. Okay, let's wrap this up.
Muhammad once called for polytheism and recognized 3 female deities as daughters of Allah. This delighted his pagan opponents, but soon after Muhammad said he was told by Gabriel that he never gave him these polytheistic verses, and he gave him other verses to recite in their place. People became suspicious of Muhammad's claim to prophecy as a result, and God sends him another verse, this time in chapter 22, verse 52, saying that Satan had cast those words on his tongue, and that this had occurred with many of the previous prophets too. That just seems too convenient.
All right, so he's referring to what has been called within, the West, the satanic verses. This event that some Muslims are just not aware of this, but it is within Muslim sources. It's referred to the story of Gharaniq. Right, Gharaniq. Gharaniq are referring to a type of bird like a crane or a pelican, a bird with a long neck. Gharaniq. And so this is something where I'll tell you the story and the different details of this. And this is not something new from the masked Arab. You have a lot of atheists and enemies of Islam pointing to this and saying, oh, this is proof that Islam is a fabrication and is false. So it's good for Muslims to be aware of this and understand it from a very clear, objective point of view, so that you don't get, shaken up when you hear it and you get caught off guard. So the authentic version of what has happened here, and this is recorded in Sahih Bukhari, is that the Prophet ﷺ, this was shortly after Hijrah, he's reciting the ayat of Surah An-Najm. And this is a very emotional surah. It's a very powerful surah. And he gets to the end of the surah, the last ayah of the surah. And he recites, فَاسْجُدُوا لِلَّهِ وَاعْبُدُوا. So he says, prostrate to Allah and worship. This is the last ayah of Surah An-Najm. And when the Prophet ﷺ recites this, all the Muslims make sujood, but then also the Quraysh, the mushrikeen, also make sajda when the Prophet ﷺ recites this, because the ayah is so powerful and the surah was so powerful that everyone just has this visceral reaction of prostrating, of making sajda, even the disbelievers. And so this is the authentic version that is narrated in Sahih Bukhari. But there's another version that adds a certain extra detail. Okay, and this is what is referred to as the satanic verses or Gharaniq. And but this detail is not authentic. It's not found in any of the books of hadith. It's really just tertiary sources that are citing this, and the majority of scholars in history have said that this is not authentic, that this is actually either very weak or it's a fabrication. Okay, so just important to keep those details in mind. But in this other version, what's said is that while the Prophet ﷺ is reciting Surah An-Najm, Iblis comes, okay, and Iblis whispers to the Prophet ﷺ 2 verses from himself, and these 2 verses are, let me say it exactly. Basically, the 2 verses are that the Gharaniq are to be praised and their intercession is accepted. Okay, these idols. So this is shirk, right? And then in this version, the Prophet ﷺ recites, thinking that this is from Jibril, recites these two verses. Okay? So this is one version. And then later Jibril comes and tells the Prophet ﷺ that this was not from me, this was from Iblis. And so then the Prophet ﷺ corrects that. And he corrects that. So the enemies of Islam and these atheists will cite this and say that, oh, see, the Prophet ﷺ couldn't even distinguish the revelation from Jibril ﷺ and then the whispering of Iblis. And so this is the argument that they make against Islam. But this is addressed, okay? So the majority, as I said, the majority of scholars said that this is fabricated. This detail is fabricated. It's not true. Some of them said that it's very weak, and so it's not reliable to think that this actually took place. But there are some scholars, some major scholars, that said, no, this is authentic. We should be able to take it as being authentic. And then they prove this, and they try to cite or explain why this is authentic. And so one of the main, most notorious people who are arguing for this is Ibn Taymiyyah. Ibn Taymiyyah is one of the ones who really tries to argue that this is actually authentic. But he makes an interesting argument that even if we think that this is inauthentic or fabricated, it's still good to understand what Ibn Taymiyyah says about this, because it can defend against these attacks. What Ibn Taymiyyah says is that, well, look at Surah Al-Hajj. Okay? And Allah says in Surah Al-Hajj, and we did not send before you any messenger or prophet that when he spoke, Satan threw into his recitation some misunderstanding. But Allah abolishes that which Satan throws into the recitation, and then Allah makes precise his verses, and Allah is knowing and wise. That is so that He, meaning Allah, may make what Satan throws in a trial, a fitna for those within whose hearts is a disease. And indeed, the wrongdoers are in extreme dissension. And so those who were given knowledge may know that it's the truth from your Lord, and therefore believe in it, and their hearts humbly submit to it. And indeed, Allah is the guide of those who have believed to the straight path. So this is in Surah Al-Hajj. And mashallah, I mean, this is what Allah is saying, that, well, in the recitation, there has been no messenger, no prophet that has come except that Satan, Shaitan, Iblis comes and throws in his recitation some confusion, some misunderstanding. But Allah abolishes that and wipes it out and corrects it so that the revelation of Allah is precise. Okay? So Allah is referring to this in the Quran. So Ibn Taymiyyah points to this, that the fact that this ayah exists, this provides evidence that this event of the Quranic and what I described to you is authentic. This is one of the evidences that he uses. So this is not really a problem for believers. It shouldn't make us doubt or have questions about revelation or the Quran. And Ibn Taymiyyah here makes a very interesting argument. He says that actually the fact that this happened, according to him, that this happened, this is more proof that the Prophet ﷺ is honest. This is more proof that he's telling the truth and that what he is reciting is from Allah. And it doesn't have any mistakes. Because this mistake that came, he corrected it. So that proves that. That gives us more credence and more evidence that he is truthful as a messenger conveying the message of Allah. And so this is what Ibn Taymiyyah argues, and I think it's very interesting. And the analogy, I was just reflecting on this, thinking about my own children. So I have 4 boys, alhamdulillah, and they all have different personalities, and every now and then they get into fights and arguments. And so I'll be in a different room and I'll hear them fighting, and then 2 of them will start crying. And then I'll go and I'll ask, so, what happened? Why are you crying? And so one of them will always say that, oh, he's at fault. My brother's at fault. He's the one who hit me or did something to me. One of them will always say that. But the second one has a different personality. and he'll say that, most of the time he hit me, he's at fault. But then once in a while he'll say, well, I actually hit him. I was the aggressor. I'm the one who hit him or committed some kind of injustice against him. So which son am I going to trust more? Right? Which son am I going to trust more? This is counterintuitive, because one is always saying that he is innocent and his brother is guilty. He's always saying that. But the other one admits in certain circumstances that he's at fault. But counterintuitively, the one that admits that he's at fault or that he's made a mistake is more trustworthy. I trust him more because he admitted it in certain circumstances. So in other circumstances, I'm going to have more confidence in what he is saying is the truth. And so Ibn Taymiyyah uses this kind of counterintuitive reasoning. It makes perfect sense that this is actually proof that the Prophet ﷺ is accurate and honest and sadiq in what he is conveying. Because he, in this case, according to this narration, he made a mistake and then he corrected it. Right? So, this is what Ibn Taymiyyah says. And again, the majority of scholars say that this is a fabrication, that there was no such event that happened. And they'll use different arguments. Like some scholars say that if you look at Surah An-Najm, it has many ayat that are against shirk and are denouncing the idols of the Quraysh. So then how is it that no one would have recognized that those who are listening to the ayat as the Prophet ﷺ is reciting, that, the Prophet ﷺ is reciting, praising Gharaniq and saying that their intercession is accepted or their intercession is whatever. And then later other ayat are denouncing shirk, denouncing the mushrikeen. How would they have not been upset by that and recognize the contradiction? So these are different. This is a different conversation. It's not something that is refuting Islam or bringing any doubt on Islam or reason why Muslims should have less confidence in revelation. Okay, so alhamdulillah, that is the masked Arab, 7 reasons why I left Islam. As you can see, full of logical errors, full of misrepresentation, full of superficial understanding. It's just a complete mess. So if you want to refute Islam and you want to challenge Islam, you have to do your due diligence. You have to avoid these kinds of basic errors like begging the question, circular reasoning, assuming the contrary of your opponent, arguing in bad faith, right? Rolling your eyes and making silly statement that, this is so convenient, right? So I'm not really impressed by this effort from the masked Arab. And so if you appreciated this analysis, let me know in the comments. Like the video, share it, inshallah. Like I said, the masked Arab has about 1 million views on this video that I just broke down for you. So we need to provide a response. So if you think that this was a good response, then share it, and hopefully we can have it be as something that others can see as well, inshallah. Okay, so jazakumullahu khairan for listening, and this was another episode of Muslim Skeptic Live. I'm your brother Daniel Haqiqatjou. Look in the comments for links to my website, alasna.org. If you appreciated this analysis and you like kind of the way I'm approaching these issues, then seriously consider registering for Alasna Institute, alasna.org, where I teach on all of these modern issues, how to break down atheistic arguments, modernist arguments in detail. And so we have classes on all of this. So if this is something that you appreciate and you want to do it yourself, you want to be able to provide this kind of dawah, then I highly recommend that you register for alasna.org, and hopefully you'll do so. And then I'll be able to teach you, inshallah, some of these methods and these ideas. So that's all from me. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.